You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Andrea Pitts, who teaches in the Department of Philosophy at University of North Carolina at Charlotte, in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they are also affiliated with a number of other programs, including the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, the Women and Gender Studies program, and the Social Aspects of Health initiative. Andrea has published widely on Latin America and Latinx philosophy, as well as decolonial and postcolonial approaches to European thinkers, with particular emphasis on how such thinkers help us reimagine approaches to gender, race, sexuality, nation, and carcerality. In this conversation, we discuss Andrea's new book, Nos Otras, Gloria Anzaldúa, Multiplicitous Agency and Resistance, which was published in late 2021 by State University of New York Press. Our conversation here focuses on key concepts and arguments in the book about the place of race, gender, and nation in the work of Anzaldúa and its implications for the theory and practice of philosophy. Andrea, welcome. It's good to see you.
Hi, John. It's good to see you as well.
I'm really happy that you made time to talk about your new book. I was really excited when I saw it. It's one of these things where I saw it in one of these, flyers or catalog early announcements, and I had really high hopes for the book just because of the topic. I just think it's so essential and urgent and long overdue. And really, the book, reading it, just really exceeded my expectations. I think it's incredibly interesting. It's really smart. It's an amazing blend of textual study and original reflection. And as I said, it's such an urgent project. I just can't even tell you how grateful I am that you wrote the book. So thank you for that. I just wanted to start with that because it's important.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate the kind words and the taking the time to read it so carefully. I appreciate that.
Sure. And so maybe this as a way of getting started, I'd like to ask people to narrate their way into the project for us, and you can get at that however you want, whether it's, sort of ethical, political, philosophical concerns or personal or the blend of those. And I'd like to ask because I just think the origins of projects are really interesting. But also, writing a book takes over your entire life, and everything from your professional life to your self-esteem to, your own intellectual aspirations are totally at stake. So it's a lot to take on, right? And so I always think these stories about how we got to these projects, because something must motivate us to put in this kind of effort and take these kinds of intellectual and I would always say emotional risks as well. So how'd you come to this project and why write it now?
Thanks for that. So I've been studying Anzaldúa since, or at least reading her since undergrad, and kind of taking a concerted interest in her work certainly during grad school. And her work eventually played a central role in my dissertation when I was working my PhD. And so I was at that time in graduate school, I became really interested in her conceptions of self-writing and autobiography. So I was taking classes both in philosophy and in Latin American literary studies. And her work had kind of stood out to me for how to do really close analysis of one's own positionality, experiences, context, concerns, desires, fears, conflicts, the things that are kind of the existential stakes of writing, and then also how she did it with a community-directed approach, so that it wasn't just personal introspection for the sake of individual exploration. It was theoretically and practically oriented towards growth with others. And I thought that there was something really, both beautiful and politically important about that communal and collective task of self-exploration. And so one of the things that I've come to kind of more carefully think through now, and that I think drove this book in particular, so different from the dissertation, was that I think there's also some kind of ongoing, I mean, as you and probably lots of your listeners are aware, these kind of strengthening um, forms of individualism, and certainly kind of neoliberal agential models that, when we're thinking about who we are or what we want to be, we're kind of in control of how others see us, or that we have some kind of choice about
Yeah.
how we're going to choose a little of this or a little of that and become who we want to be. And I think there's something really dangerous about those hyper individualized models, because what they do is they may localize or foreclose ways of thinking about our political concerns or our social conflicts that don't um, gear us towards the collective tasks that are actually the best ways that we have to address forms of oppression or forms of harm or forms of conflict that we might be confronting. And so really what I was hoping that the book could do was shift from thinking about agency from an individualized context to a more plural and social context, but also one that is thinking about historical and relational interdependencies. And so I think the book was trying to do that. And also, I was just reading. I'm teaching a class right now on epistemic injustice and epistemologies of resistance, and we just read a piece by Patricia Hill Collins on epistemic injustice and intersectionality, and she makes this really beautiful point about, you know, Black feminists of the 1980s and 90s, who were activists long before they ever became academics, started entering into higher ed in the 1980s and 90s and 70s. So she's thinking Toni Cade Bambara, Barbara Smith, but she's also mentioning other women of color at the time. And these folks include Anzaldúa, who
Uh,
in the 70s enters in the University of Texas, in the 80s, the UC Santa Cruz, and starts introducing concepts from their activist work. And so it's also, and what Collins names in this piece is also that trend to take those resources from activists and the existential stakes of communities of color, and then try
mm,
to make them more palatable in a higher ed setting, or make them more to neutralize their political critique in academia. And so she's
yeah.
critiquing that, and she's concerned about that. And I think part of this book was also an attempt to try to reclaim and resituate the practical and the kind of political and urgent stakes from Anzaldúa's work that would allow us to resist also some of that neutralizing and individualizing tropes from her work.
Yeah, there's so much in that. I'm glad I asked. Every time I ask this, I'm like, people's narration into their own projects is in some ways as interesting as the project, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, as you're pointing out, I mean, we write books, right? And we
Yeah.
write books, most of us, about books other people wrote, and so this sense of sort of voice, activism, method, framing, you know, struggle against neutralization.
Right,
Um,
right.
and I think that sort of that plurality that you're talking about in Anzaldúa's work, um, as well as the other people you mentioned, Bambara, etc. I mean, I think that you not only do you does your book give a nice reckoning with that kind of voice, but you embody that also as a writer in really interesting and I think not self-indulgent ways. I think
Thank
what
you.
you're talking about can be really self-indulgent,
Sure, sure.
but I but your book, is emphatically not that. But I also like that in the way you were talking about it, and the way I read your book is also that way that we learn from the people we read and interpret, right?
Yes, yes.
And part of that learning sometimes is how to talk and how to write.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So let me ask you, I mean, this sort of plurality question sort of leads to this, a question about the title. Titles are extremely interesting. I don't know how you do work with titles and essays in this book, but I'm always a title first person, and sort of end up working towards the title after I come up with it. But whatever the process, I think, titles where the publisher lets you title it, which I was glad that Anzaldúa was not in the title, right? That you were able to title this book as you wanted. I've had, it's always a struggle for me with my book titling, but I wanted you to sort of walk through it. I mean, it's two words and a slash, right?
Mm-hmm.
And evokes simultaneously, right? Nos and otras. Uh, Simultaneously evokes us or we, and that difference might make a difference, and others, right? Which is a really compelling evocation, right? Inside Anzaldúa's text, but also for sort of post 1968 philosophy in the Atlantic world, so post independence in the South Atlantic, certainly, and in Europe. This sense of the other, right? But it's so
Mm-hmm.
interesting the way, of course, you're evoking simultaneously not the I or the me, but the us and the we. So I wanted you to sort of talk through those terms and what they mean, why this is your title, but maybe as much as that, why the slash? Why not a
Mm-hmm.
comma? Why not an em dash? Why not a space? Right? The slash, I don't know, I don't want to
Interesting.
overread, but it's these things are always for me so interesting, these choices. So maybe walk us through the title. It's two short words and a slash.
Yeah. So yeah. Thanks for the care and analyzing the title or thinking through the title. So, um, I'll first just be upfront that it's not my term. So that's actually a term
Yeah,
directly from Anzaldúa's work. So nos slash otras. And so I actually want it was both meant to refer directly to something that I saw as relevant in her later works, actually her dissertation writings of the 90s and early 2000s, right before her death, and also something that I think carries out that spirit of the book of kind of thinking through agency in a way that is both able to negotiate our collective projects and collective social movements, but also the work of the self, the existential stakes of the self, that is not yet done in isolation, but that is
yeah,
done perhaps for political reasons to localize around conversations of the self and personal experience and personal pain and things like that, but which are also themselves, I think, importantly um, interdependent upon others and on our material
hmm
world. So it shares a lot of resonances with the themes of the book, and I think I chose it from Anzaldúa's writings, particularly because I thought it had that nuance. But I think just back to the also just to briefly mention something about the origins is that um, one of the things that I also, as somebody who's now been thinking with Anzaldúa's work and her readers, the interpreters and the critics and people who have appreciated and been thinking with her work for a very long time, it's that I think a lot of folks don't often read past her 1987 book Borderlands La Frontera, and so I wanted to choose a term also that kind of brought us to her later writings to really encourage readers to grapple with what she wrote after the 1980s and that she had
yeah,
nearly a decade and a half after Borderlands to really continue working as a theorist, as a writer, as an activist. And I think that the choice of the term from her later work is one that I also was intentional about because I wanted it to really reflect on the breadth of her work as a
uh-huh.
scholar and as an intellectual. So I think so. And also just to kind of just to thread us through what I take her to mean by it. Um, as you mentioned, the book brings out several connotations of nos slash otras. So this us other distinction, it's also the Castilian Spanish term for the first personal pronoun us, but in the feminine, which again, if you track Anzaldúa's work, you're seeing her trying to call attention to non-dominant sites of collective
Mm-hmm.
creation and collective articulation. And I think nos otras, even with the slash, which I'll mention here in just a minute, is one that is also meant to be coming from a non-dominant a space of articulation. So I think that
Yeah.
that matters for some of the book's both audience and the her audience as well, in terms of the kind
Mm-hmm.
of collective work she was doing. In terms of in terms of social ontology, I think part of what she's naming with collectivities, and especially with the forging or the kind of dynamism of the forging of collective groups through something like the articulation of an us or a we, is also the kind of maybe inevitability of internal difference and potential division. And so what she calls la rajadura, the slash, is also the kind of wounding or the kind of cut that happens
Uh-huh.
within communities that not only experience internal fracturing, like in terms of conflict, but also in terms of how people find themselves located
Mm-hmm.
within social groups. That then, anyone who's kind of dealt with the kind of either systemic exclusion or kind of discomfort or dissonance within social group identities also feels that slash of that potential wounding in terms of trying to remain committed to a politic or a
Uh-huh.
solidarity, but also negotiating discomfort and potentially pain or harm. And so I think that like
Uh-huh.
that part of what she's naming is that the existential and ontological conditions of social group existence. And I think, again, just to harken back to some of the motivations for the book, I think some of that view about collectivities and the inevitability of conflict and difference within social collectivities also helps kind of push away from some of these more like mainstream views about intersectionality, like these kind of pop bead models that even someone like Elizabeth Spellman was critiquing, like back in the 80s, that like
Uh-huh.
everyone has
Uh-huh.
like their racial group, their class group, their sexual group, and that somehow those are unified or internally consistent in a way that allows us to make
Yeah.
sense of our identity. And I don't think that I think Anzaldúa and Bambara and the folks who are kind of really introducing the political stakes of coalitional work among communities of color and feminists of color are really grappling with internal difference, division, and conflict. And I think that is
Yeah.
something that I think gets lost in some mainstream views about either feminist politics or intersectionality or what have you. So I think the title is really meant to flag also dissonance, and I think that dissonance among collectivities, which I think is an important theme throughout the book, as you saw. So
Yeah, that's really brilliant. I love that, and I think that you know, I mean, there are lots of things I hope you know people get from the book and that people read the book and take seriously. But if just that collectivity and dissonance like can be thought together in the ways that you
yeah,
do in the book, and people work with that, I just think that's as you articulated it just now, all by itself. But of course, that's the some of the core arguments or demonstrations in the book. I mean, I think that's transformative, right? And I think that's
thank you.
you Anzaldúa onto something like really, really profound. And it's interesting to me. I mean, I don't, you don't have to remark on this, but it is interesting, even in your explanation, and of course in Anzaldúa's text, the way that also is. I don't want to say dependent on, but is sort of revealed in language play, right?
Yes,
which
yes,
is which is in Spanish, right?
yes.
She's able to pick up this collectivity, dissonance, resonance, etc., non-domination, the feminine, and so forth, right? That the language difference makes a difference there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, there's a lot to say about that. About not only Anzaldúa's kind of linguistic creativity and
Mm-hmm.
kind of the political role of not just Castilian Spanish and English, but also Spanglish, Tejano dialects. I mean, there's so much play materially in the language for her. So I think that's another thematic here, is that, I also am able to write a philosophical book with a Spanish language title, at least for the main title, in a way that is now also trying to pluralize the ways that we're, thinking through social group formation, right? So this is not,
Mm-hmm.
not that, obviously themes of fragmentation have been addressed in many other philosophical, um, uh, approaches and disciplines and traditions and so on. But I think what's interesting to me about this one is also the Latina, Latinx, Mexican American, Chicana, Chicanx kind of roots of grounding this within a dialogue among
Mm-hmm.
racialized and culturally situated communities, gender or sexually situated communities that I myself am accountable to with respect to my own
Yeah.
experiences in life and my research. So I think that was also a big part of that.
And also, I'll just say this is an aside, but it's an aside that I think just underscores like another another level of significance of this book is the way you were just talking there about the complexity of even naming what this sort of language moment is,
Yeah.
right? In terms of Spanglish, Castilian Spanish, English, borderlands as a linguistic moment. Um, I mean, the connections of that to Caribbean theory around creolization, I think, is super interesting. I might want to ask you a little bit about similar things later. But also, I think this is one of these moments for philosophers, sort of in the Atlantic world, we'll just stick to the United States since that's where we both live, where there's such a mystification and in a good way and real deep appreciation for how German as a language or Greek as an ancient language,
Mm.
right, reveals things that other languages can't because of some sort of inherent properties. But, Spanish, Spanglish, borderland languages, whether it's in the Caribbean or in this case, uh, in the borderlands of the North Americas, um, that has been completely absent from all that really rich work on how language is able to reveal something about being, about knowing, and so forth. And
Mm.
so, I mean, it's one of my pet peeves that so few philosophers learn to read Spanish. Um,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
but I mean, your book makes a case not just for like, hey, here's some other texts that you could learn from, but instead, like, you know, that sort of limit on language engagement is its own kind of trap in a kind of authority or missing opportunity to think about plurality in really important new ways.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I agree, and I mean, I do believe there are, philosophers, like some of whom were, some of the both mentors for my writing prior to this, and so on, like Mariano Ortega and others who have really also been exploring the depths of Latina, Latinx linguistic practice and that kind of stuff. So I also feel myself very much indebted to a community of people who have been working through
Yeah.
non-Eurocentric, non-Anglocentric languages to the extent that they're trying to really forge, new kind of plural pathways for doing philosophy and so on. So yeah, I do see myself as part of that trajectory of those folks as well.
That's a
Yeah.
great trajectory. Yeah, we need more. We
Thanks.
need more and more prominence of that because it's, as I think your book and Mariana's book, work, and so many others. I mean, it's like this is being demonstrated over and over, and sort of, I'm hoping it's a part of a transformative momentum. I could go on and on about this, but vernacular language, is so transformative of how we know and be, and so
Yes.
these kinds of engagements are really critical. Well, let me ask, and then this way we haven't even gotten into the book, although title and subtitle get you deep into books. Ask about the subtitle, right?
Yes.
Multiplicitous agency. I have to practice that word. I have a hard time with that one. Multiplicitous agency, right, is really, at least to my eyes, the concept that pulls the book together, right? And your subtitle links that to resistance. So just in terms of the key concept, maybe say a few words about multiplicitous agency and what drew you to that as a philosopher, but also how you see it expanding or deepening our understanding of resistance, which I think can often get very one-dimensional. But this is a
Yeah.
really complicated idea of resistance, and its relationship to multiplicitous agency is critical. I mean, it's in the subtitle, but it's also, I think, part of the sort of political explosion of the book in so many ways.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess one way to kind of frame this was through back to this question about self-writing. That part of thinking through self-writing as collective practice that's forging and helping shape resistance practices. So one thing that really stood out to me from reading Anzaldúa was her interest in the kind of material and physical aspects of writing, the kind of materiality of writing, and not just the materiality of language, but also the material processes that have to come together to be able to, put words in print, in ink, in
Yeah.
through a scribe, what have you, right? So
Yeah.
the kind of material conditions that are part of that, and there's a lot of really great, not only kind of Marxist theorists, but also Sarah Ahmed and others who are really thinking through the materiality of writing and language as well. But or anyone who reads prison writings or thinks about art created within carceral context sees those material demands for writing, right? The need for
Yeah.
ink, pen, paint, and so on. And so what's really um, uh, what's one of the things I learned from visiting Anzaldua's archive was that she actually aspired to be a painter and a visual artist, but
Amazing.
she writes that the canvas and the paints were far too expensive for her to have access to, and reporters' notebooks and pencils were way more easily available, and so she chose writing as the venue for her creative expression because out of necessity, right? Out of the kind of the access to those material media in order to
Yeah.
to express and to create. And so I think not only in her published works do we see that emphasis on the materiality of writing, but also on in if you listen to her interviews or her other kind of unpublished, if you have access to her unpublished work, that's also a really nice way to think about this aspect of her work. So in that sense, writing is never that individual intellectual, if you think about it in its material dimensions, it's not that kind of isolated individualist activity, and it becomes more of this kind of the collective processes that make that creation possible. And so I think
Yeah.
that was the broader sense of thinking through writing, both in my earlier work on this and for this book. And so I took language and writing as examples of agential activity. And I wanted to understand how we could develop tools to reinterpret actions, including linguistic actions and written actions more broadly. So, also for finding resources for interpreting forms of what we might call something like micro resistances or ambiguous acts that themselves could lead to potential transformation or change. And so,
Yeah.
as you probably recall, Leonard Harris plays this really pivotal role in the center of the book. His
Yeah.
insurrectionist ethics in the third chapter kind of is this framing of trying to understand the multidimensionality of resistance, and also
Uh-huh.
the moral stakes of supporting insurrectionist and resistant acts,
Yeah.
but also
Yeah.
yeah. And so I think part of this work was trying to put some of these meta-philosophical tools from Harris and others into dialogue with people who are thinking about these really the micro practice of writing and self-expression as
Uh-huh.
resistant
Uh-huh.
activity. And so it kind of has that I'm kind of trying to bridge these different conversations and dialogues to again shift away from thinking of writing as this like solitary, exclusive,
Yeah.
private, self-indulgent practice, and to really have this more multivalent possibility for not just writing as in terms of biography or autobiography, but also the kind of work that philosophers do, that we
Hmm.
should and can have political stakes in the kind of work that we do. And I know
Hmm.
that your work embodies that, and a lot of the other amazing people you've interviewed on this podcast embody that as well. But I also think that philosophically, some of that, the motivations that Harris and Lugones and Anzaldúa and others really bring out in their work is that, we can be in the service and ought to be in the service of transforming the material
Hmm.
worlds that we're in. We rely on those material worlds to do the work we do, and that,
Hmm.
we should be bringing that out through our political praxis. And so I think, and our philosophical praxis. So I think I think the multiplicitous agency in the book is really trying to look at a variety of actions, but linguistic and written agency as one of those
Hmm.
kind of core themes throughout. So that's
Yeah, I mean the, I think I think philosophy in particular, but probably all writerly disciplines, um, are just so held captive at the level of the imagination of what we do and what others do by paintings, right? People
yeah,
sitting at desks with a little pen, like or sitting at a computer in a coffee shop. But the attentiveness to the material motivations. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say what you just said, and then think about, I always ask at the beginning of these podcasts, what motivated you to write the book, and every single time it's about some fairly deep stakes about changing, the world of ideas and being accountable to communities or to the call of a certain text, or the way
mm-hmm.
a person felt implicated in what they read and how they thought about writing, and the influence of voice of who you write about in your own compositional process. And those dynamics are so complicated. You can't paint that in a
Yeah,
of a well lit corner of somebody with a feather pen, or however we mythologize it. So, and that's, as you've been talking about, that's how getting to, you know Anzaldúa's own process. It's totally fascinating to talk about, like, wanting to be a painter, but given the material conditions, painting wasn't possible, but writing was. And that says
mm-hmm.
something, I think, about expressive culture, uh, of which writing is one part, right? Expressive culture and this content of philosophy,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
in really important ways, because, um, you know, and maybe this is it's a question I want to ask you in a little bit, but about philosophy in relation to this, but maybe even just more general. You've talked about this in some ways, but just to ask it very directly, why Anzaldúa? For you, in
yeah,
particular, like, what drew you to these ideas, but also to these texts, and the two are so intertwined, of course.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, I mean, as I mentioned, I started reading. I first picked up Anzaldúa and Sri Moraga's "This Bridge Called My Back" when I was an undergrad, and it was actually Sri Moraga's poems in that book that were really transformative to me, and really, for me, struck an existential chord that I hadn't read in any other context. And so
Uh,
it was personally, as a mixed race Latinx young person who was queer identified and living in multiple worlds. So my parents have been divorced since I was a child, but my mom's Panamanian American, bilingual, working class. My father's Southern American, white man from an aspirationally middle class family. And so, and my both of my parents were hippies, are hippies, and have supported various countercultural movements and practices and cultural production throughout my life. And so that was, from very, like, specific examples to, like, the Jehovah's Witnesses as a religious counterculture, to also, like, anti-war and like, pro cannabis and all kinds of stuff that were very much part of my upbringing. And so, like, that included very permissive parenting, but also unconditional love from them. And so I felt very well supported by that kind of, like, clash and mixture of influences growing up. But also, Moraga and Anzaldúa's work gave me some language and names and conceptual possibilities for understanding these very different life worlds among the different valences of my family, the different people, and the different values and interests that my family held and does hold. And so I think Moraga and Anzaldúa were some of the first authors and queer writers themselves to kind of give me language to start interpreting the world around me, as both, trying to understand my childhood and also my young adulthood, as someone who was also trying to support family members through domestic violence or through drug and alcohol addiction and things like that, which have also shaped my life. And so like things like that, I'm only now in post the book also continuing to work through, for example, the disability politics of Anzaldúa. So I have a chapter on disability politics and disability justice in Anzaldúa, but that's something that I've also kind of heard. Anzaldúa's work has really started giving me and continues to give me language to try to understand things like disability or access to material health resources and things like that, which are themselves, still pressing concerns. I mean, obviously, we're living in a pandemic right now, so I mean, those are ongoing questions and needs. And so I think her work was urgent in a way that I think was like answering and giving me language for my own experience. But then also, just to kind of pick up on that thread that I mentioned, also, like I'm also really drawn to art and film and writing that I think implicates the audience and the reader and the viewer, so that
Mm-hmm.
you can't
Yeah.
passively and become involved with the work in that way. And I think that Anzaldúa's writing, as well as a number of other authors, but Anzaldúa for sure, she's somebody who really wants the author to be involved in a process through reading, right? It's not a passive process. And so I think I see something like a collaborative reading practice as part of what she envisioned, and I wanted to kind of like honor that and think through that, because I think that's a really important dimension of her work. And then just the last kind of point about Anzaldúa. So I mentioned I've been reading her for a long time, but I was also around a group of really fantastic, scholars and friends throughout my graduate life, um, through largely the Latina Feminism Roundtable hosted by Mariana Ortega. And so Mariana created and curated this space for senior and junior folks to really study and deeply engage with Anzaldúa. So, like, just to give quick shout outs to like Natalie Cisneros, Kelly Zaytun, Julie Minich, Maria Chavez Daza, Mariana Alessandri, Emma Velez, and of course Mariana Ortega herself. Like, those folks were the ones who, like, they have also given Anzaldúa's work life and breadth and complexity in ways that I have learned from tremendously, and I'm continuing to learn from them, and also being able to kind of build something with them. And so
Yeah.
I think that in a way the book is also deeply indebted to having been fortunate to have had a community of Latina and Latinx people around me that were doing the work on Anzaldúa. So I really see that as a collective, I really see the book as a collective process in that way as well.
Yeah, I love that. I'm glad you gave shout outs as a, as a shout out safe zone. But I mean, especially because, it goes to this, you know, truth that I think often gets lost about forming, roundtables or groups or, however it's cast of particular um, identity groups. I mean, that's kind of a boring way to put it, but I think people often, especially white people, imagine that to be like some sort of like club or whatever, but that's deep intellectual space in which a whole
Absolutely.
intellectual tradition of commentary comes from. And
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
I really love that that it's a shout out not only to friends and teachers but also to the origins of what has been and will continue to be just a transformative part of philosophy. Uh, and also, speaking of clubs, we should have the Philosopher Children of Hippies Club. I'm also, my parents were LA hippies. And so it's a real thing to have grown up
It is a
in.
thing. Yeah, it is a thing.
And people talk about their parents and what that relationship was like, and 99 times out of 100 I'm like, what are you talking about? And then when I hear permissive parenting, I had ups and downs and whatever, I'm like, oh yeah, hippie parents, I know that
Yep.
experience. um, but really that would be a great subgroup at the APA or something.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
So let me pick up with a thing from Anzaldúa. Of course, sort of central to her thinking is this notion of mestiza. It's in the subtitle of Borderlands La Frontera. But that notion as a broader, like sort of outside Anzaldúa, as a broader political and cultural identity
Yeah.
claim is something that's come under a lot of criticism, right? Including from you in your fifth and final chapter. So I want to ask you sort of two-part question, although I imagine they intertwine into sort of one. What's at stake in that notion of mestiza in Anzaldúa, and what is important about the critique you offer in both thinking about this category of mestiza, of mixedness? I mean, this is a question
Mm-hmm.
across the Americas, of course. Um, in establishing that, arguing for it, and critiquing it. So, what are the stakes here?
Well, actually, one of the like my early conversations with folks about those stakes were with Ofelia Schuta when I was doing my MA research, and she was really careful to point to the relationship between the naming of someone like Jose Vasconcelos in Anzaldúa's work and the nationalist projects of mestizaje in Mexico in the early 20th century. So she really was trying to build pedagogical um, space and philosophy to have deep conversations about those potential relationships and the potential concerns that people might have, like deep critiques of Mexican and mestizo nationalism, for example, in the 20th century, which included, anti-blackness, it included, the thwarting of indigenous land claims in Mexico. It included the primitivization or the kind of making of an indigenous past to Mexican nationalism and Mexican modernism that itself continues to displace indigenous futurities and indigenous life and creation in Mexico. And so I think one of the things that Ophelia was really trying to caution her students with was not to be too hasty in terms of wanting to take up what Anzaldúa is calling new Mestiza consciousness as a as a simple or as a particularly progressive or transformative form of identification. And although I would say since that time with Ophelia, I've continued to research Vasconcelos and Anzaldúa, and I do see differences in how they approach the concept of mestizaje itself. So, like, just one quick one, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that Vasconcelos saw mestizaje, kind of racial, cultural mixing in the Americas and in Mexico in particular, as resulting in this kind of like what he considered a kind of monism, this kind of aesthetic harmony that would bring together all the peoples and ideas and values in the world of the Western Hemisphere, let's say, or at least Latin America, and then and be able to kind of bring forward this like beautiful and good future. So like in literally the values of beauty and goodness are part of that aesthetic future. And he called it aesthetic eugenics. I mean, like he's not shy about the language at the time, but he's
Old.
also yeah, well, he's also trying to respond to evolutionary theory and philosophical views and political views at the time of the potential regressiveness of mixture. And so he's responding to a scientific discourse as well as a positivistic discourse within Mexico itself that's saying that mixture is regressive and that whitening and Eurocentrism is the future. And so he's also, he's given in his context, he's also responding to those problems. But what's I think significant about, and I mentioned this in the book and I mentioned this elsewhere, is that Anzaldúa does invoke Vasconcelos, but she also rejects the view of harmony that he offers. And so if you read her carefully, what she says is she's like, the new mestiza has the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? The ugly for Vasconcelos is shed off. And for Vasconcelos, it's blackness and the laboring life of Black peoples is part of the ugly. I mean, he has, anti-Asian, anti-Arab, anti-Jewish. He has a lot of cultural and historical traditions that are themselves now comprising the parameters of his aesthetics. For Anzaldúa, she's not accepting that. What she's saying is that things that are being invoked as the good, the bad, and the ugly are part of the futurity of the mestiza as well. And what she's doing is trying to negotiate those conflicts and tensions. And so I see there's like continuities with Vasconcelos, but also not this kind of harmonic synthesis, right? There's not this kind of like, you know, resolution. And so I see her work as also contesting resolution, contesting finality, and accepting conflict, and as I mentioned, dissonance, and the need for redress for wounding and harm. And I
Yeah.
think, like the title of the book says, and like Mestizaje itself, right? Though there are patterns and deeply implicated cultural wounds within what gets named in cultural and racial mixing in the Americas and in the Caribbean, right? So like those are not harmonic projects, right? Despite the racial democracy of Brazil or the other nationalistic projects that have tried to give it that kind of valence. So I think she's also naming the conflict there. But I also saw the term nosotras from her later work as a response to some of the criticism she received about Mestiza consciousness and about the new mestiza from her earlier work. So I chose nosotras as a term that I think kind of shows her transformation of thought over time. That by the 1990s, the late 90s, she had received criticisms during her life about indigenous politics, contemporary indigenous politics, that she was now being asked, like, are you actually supporting this work? Are you are you or are you kind of further adding to the kind of myth of mestizo modernism that places indigenous peoples in a distant past? I mean, and you can see this too through some of her invocation of like Nahua metaphysics or Aztec or Mexica metaphysics and so on. So she was criticized for that during her lifetime, but she also was developing new language and new ways to try to like revisit some of the old themes in her book. And so it's really interesting to even see some videos from her archive where like she'll use new language like nosotras, she'll use some of the new language from her later work to like reread passages from Borderlands La Frontera. And so she'll do this like interesting like intertextual work within her own writing to try to like reframe and revisit things that she's working on. So I found that really important. And I also think the last, as you mentioned, that fifth chapter, just real quickly. So like that fifth chapter really takes up carefully, like, okay, people have viewed some folks have taken up mestiza consciousness without that full scope or without any kind of contextual or historical depth about its resonances in Latin America. And I was worried about that. And so I was worried particularly about Anglophone, and the fifth chapter is it's about Anglophone trans studies that sees Anzaldúa's work on mestiza consciousness as particularly progressive for understanding gender.
Yeah.
And so that last chapter is really saying, okay, because for example, Sandy Stone in The Empire Strikes Back, 1987, same year as Borderlands La Frontera, cites Anzaldúa as a major influence on how Stone herself is articulating trans identities and this kind of like post-transsexual moment. And so what I wanted to do in that chapter was really say, okay, if we're going to read Anzaldúa within trans studies, which I also work in trans studies and trans philosophy, what should we know about the criticisms that have been leveraged against
Yeah.
her, particularly regarding indigenous solidarity, indigenous sovereignty movements, and so on, in order so that we can build trans and gender variant discourses that are responsive to histories of settler colonialism, histories of anti-blackness, and so on. And so it was really an attempt to try to do this multiplicitous work without recreating some of the harms and conflicts that earlier framings of mestiza consciousness or mestizaje were themselves responsible for. So it was also a way to try to like do this work with Anzaldúa's writings, but from a new lens that would allow us to really try to understand the politics, for example, of indigenous sovereignty as a gender project, as a gendered project that is itself fighting against settler binaries, gender binaries, and so on. And so I really wanted to kind of bring out those dimensions of the work.
That's fantastic. I mean, that answer, especially the last bit there. I mean, it really speaks to the expansiveness of your project. That it moves in multiple directions as critique, as innovation, and so forth. So I'm glad you sort of ended with that comment about this sort of broader question of gender and settler colonialism and so forth. That's, I think, a really brilliant part of the book. Well, let me ask you a question, two-part question. So this is the first part about philosophy, right? Which we're both philosophers. Um, are we philosophers or philosophical people? I've started to say philosophical people, philosophically minded people. But you know, in this book, you know, you give a philosophical treatment of Anzaldúa's work and the issues that it raises, right? And I say philosophical treatment, and part of what I have in mind is the way a stain on a piece of wood will draw out something about the grain of the wood that without that
Mm.
stain we wouldn't really have seen, right? That there's something illuminating about treatments, right, that brings something out. And your book, as a philosophical treatment of Anzaldúa, brings out so many things, right? Many of which you've spoken about already. But I wanted to ask you, it's in some ways just a reading method question, like to reflect, like, how do you understand your own practice as a philosopher in terms of your readerly and interpretive logic? It's really just a hermeneutic question, right? The text
Mm.
brings something to us, but we bring something to the text. And what's that something you bring to the text as a philosopher that's able to transform what you're reading? Or not necessarily even transform, but draw out hidden aspects of what has been read outside of philosophy and is now being read in this hermeneutic event of philosophical reading.
Yeah. I don't know whether I'm like I've like struggled whether there's anything particularly novel that I'm doing the book on that regard, because I'm so indebted to like a lot of the folks who really shaped the method for the book. And I have to be honest that I've been really fortunate to have been educated and mentored by folks um, uh, who are doing philosophy in a way that attends to the kind of, like as I mentioned, the material and existential stakes of living and of survival. So like, just again, I want to say, like, Ofelia Schutter's work on philosophy of liberation, right? Like, if we're looking at philosophy of liberation as a praxis and as a method, we see all kinds of ways in which the spiritual or the material or the land and labor claims of what we're doing are so important. And so, like, that's one methodology. I've really been shaped by Leonard Harris's work on philosophy born of struggle, right? Philosophy born of the need to strive and survive. I mean, or Talia Betcher, what she calls these "what the fuck" questions. She's like, your philosophy is born of trying to make sense of from what the fuck is happening in my life. And so, and not even just those folks. Like, even more, like, if you want to think within a canon, Jose Medina, my advisor, he was trained in the kind of contextualism and perspectivism of Wittgenstein and the American pragmatists. And so, like Dewey and Jane Addams, John Dewey and Jane Addams. And so, like, that's also an experimentalism which takes dynamism and meliorism and fallibilism as part of their praxis. So, like, we should change and will change our views. The authors we read should change and will change their views. I mean, and to be honest, even with I was also at USF. I was also trained with people who were doing contextualist early modern European philosophy. So, like, Roger Ariev, Alex Levine. I was also working with cultural studies folks and Latin American studies, like Adriana Novoa, who's a tremendous influence in my life. And these folks are contextualists about Eurocentric philosophy. Like, they're saying we need to understand how interlocutors communicate with each other. What are the political dynamics of a given text being produced, and so on and so on. And so, like, that to me was like, I'm I'm a product of that education. I'm a product of having had those influences for reading that says, when we're wanting to understand a theorist, we're needing to attend to their life worlds and to the people they're in dialogue with. And so, as someone else has asked me about this book, I was like, this book isn't only about Anzaldúa. It's about, if as much her readers as her, because I think her readers have really, as an interpretive project, her readers make the work what it is, right? So I have this as a hermeneutic. It's also this dialogical or collective process of interpretation. And so, like, I saw both my practice as one who is trying to develop something in collectivity with others, but also that, when we go to look at a figure, we are also called to understand those interpretive lineages and those interpretive possibilities. So I think it's also just kind of a gathering. I see myself as kind of more of a gatherer than necessarily like any. I don't have like careful language about that interpretive practice, but I do see it as gathering and looking for patterns and looking for conflicts, resonance, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and on this theme of philosophy, I mean, one of the many things that interested me in your book, interested me about your book, uh, was that it was taking up the sort of things that I've been trying to do for a number of years now, may even say a couple of decades now, which makes me feel like close to retirement or something. But which is reading people philosophically whose texts do not fit with the conventional notion of what a philosophical text is. I've worked in area studies now for years, which is very different than working in a philosophy department. But even in area studies, right, Africana, Black studies, what I do for the area studies people, they're like, oh, that's philosophy, that's philosophical, right? But inside philosophy, it's difficult to say that what I do is philosophy, in this sense that there's that ideology, as you know, in the United States and in the North Atlantic world generally. There's this notion that philosophy is a property of the text we read, right, rather than something else, right? My own take is that philosophy is just a method of reading. And the style of a text is a literary question. Actually, it's not a philosophical question, but we read philosophically, right? But that turns the discipline on its head. And so I wanted to ask like your thoughts on that. Like in light of this book and what is now your longstanding interpretive, as a writer, as a speaker, as a thinker, process of making philosophical interventions in non-conventional texts in the case of the discipline of philosophy. How do you think, if taken seriously, we're taking it seriously, hopefully everybody else will, if taken seriously, your book helps shift the idea of what, quote, philosophy is, and in particular, what, quote, a philosophical text is?
Yeah, to be honest, part of that I don't know yet. I mean, I think that will depend on the reception, obviously, and on the where it goes out of my hands. But I think in a way, I mean, maybe I've been really, really lucky to have been encouraged to write about, like, for example, the dissertation had core chapters on Anzaldúa and Fanon, and they weren't chapters that I was required to rehearse some kind of comparative approach to a European or an Anglo-centric canon. So I was given the freedom and the encouragement when I was in my graduate training to explore across non-dominant methods and across non-dominant philosophical traditions. And I think I'm seeing a lot more of that among generations after me, which is also really
For sure.
exciting. And so I think, in a sense, I'm hoping that, and it's not that there are no European or Anglophone or Anglo-American philosophers that like we're going to trash those lineages. Really, what I think it is that we should parochialize those lineages, right? Like
Absolutely.
European philosophies should be parochialized for the context in which they're working and the conflicts that they're in and so on, but they're not a necessary reference point for doing philosophical work. And so I think, there's and I think really the most exciting work for me right now is like people who are being trained in non-neurocentric kind of modes of traditions and modes of doing philosophy that are themselves able to now work across different non-dominant modalities. So like for example, like
Uh-huh.
people doing Latin American and Asian philosophies, people doing African American and Latin American philosophies, people doing indigenous philosophy and Latin American philosophies, or indigenous First Nations and Native American and indigenous philosophies across the hemispheres.
Mm-hmm.
And so for example, like I was really impressed and excited by Juliet Hooker's book, because what she's doing in that book, Theorizing Race in the Americas, is what she's doing is she's not only bringing together like prominent African American political theorists and prominent Latin American political theorist, but she's also working across different language traditions. And so therefore also bringing, scholars who are trained in, um, you know, indigenous languages and Spanish are able to then write
Yeah,
across
yeah, yeah.
those, so I think that's going to be particularly exciting. And so, like not only Juliet Hooker's work and the people that she's training, but like, junior scholars like Wayne Wapimakwa, a Métis philosopher who I think the last time we spoke, I know that was working they were working on a dissertation that was looking at Métis communities in settler Canada and Mestizaje in Mexico and Latin America, right? And so
Uh-huh.
so those are really exciting ways of kind of displacing, displacing like the need to refer to European and Anglocentric philosophers, or even French philosophers in the Canadian context, to try to like figure out what is going on internally to a given
Yeah.
community or a given political space. And so I think like that's really exciting work. And I'm hoping that, if anything, the kind of way that I'm trying to pursue philosophy in the book is encouraging that type of um, work where we don't necessarily, we can and will reference, dominant traditions when we need to or when we want to, but that it doesn't become a requirement for doing philosophical work. And so I think that's
Yeah.
also, a piece of this.
Absolutely. I think myself about, my own work, your work, these people you mentioned, so many of us working in a philosophical register, but really without necessarily ever wanting to or needing to loop back into, these white North Atlantic dominant traditions. And I sort of, part of what I wonder about, and was maybe behind the question for me, is thinking about, well, there's a assertion of, this is work we do inside these intellectual traditions or comparative spaces that work outside, you know, sort of, the sort of settler colonialism of intellectual life, right? Which is that
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-American and white European thought always has to somehow be on the land we work on, so to
Right,
speak.
right.
And so I like the sort of moving into these spaces where the dynamics of reference, citation, and argument are unto themselves. And then I wonder sometimes about, is there going to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a sort of Maoist moment where we surround we surround the city of the white Atlantic world's philosophical traditions and starve it, right? Starve it in order to assert a new sense of what philosophy itself is and what a philosophical text is. And that
Mm-hmm.
gets to this insurrectionist ethics, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Which is a sort of formation of traditions and affirmation of those traditions. And then what is an insurrection? I just like the Maoist in the sense of coming from the provinces and starving the city of its lifeblood, whether those are faculty positions or journal editorialships,
Yeah.
or more deeply about the meaning of what philosophy in a philosophical text is, because there's so much implicit work being done that way, and I really like those moments where the idea of what a philosophical text is, what philosophy is there's that moment of insurrection. It's so disturbing to the profession, right? But
Yeah.
it's also liberatory. It's this way that philosophy is like 30, 40, 50 years late to what history, art history, literary studies has done.
Yes.
And so I wrestle with like whether philosophy matters that way or not. But when you mentioned the sort of ethics of insurrection or insurrectional ethics, it's sort of, I think about that at a meta level, like the history of ideas and our um, uh, our sort of tipping
Yeah.
point. That
Well, I also think, just to bring it back to Leonard Harris on that, I think that's what he's thinking of it as well, because
yeah,
his
yeah, yeah.
demand in the Insurrectionist Ethics paper is basically, you American pragmatists need to have an account of why it is morally meritorious to resist oppression, and if you don't, then you're
Uh-huh.
not you're not meeting the bar. So it does, in
Yeah,
fact,
yeah.
flip the metaphilosophical criteria, in terms of what counts as relevant work, and I think, or relevant and timely and intellectually transformative work. And so I think what's really I think inspiring and really motivating about Leonard Harris's work is precisely that metaphilosophical point about, let's shift the demands here, right? Or
Yeah,
Christy
yeah,
Dodson makes this also, like what show us, show in her paper, How is this philosophy? She's saying, Black women and Black feminists need to be given a good reason why philosophy is going to be worth their time, in
exactly.
terms of pursuing a discipline, rather than assuming that there's this kind of inclusion paradigm by which, all people should desire and aspire to be philosophy, or a philosopher, qua whatever particular criteria that a Eurocentric or an Anglophone dominant or whatever standard has. So I think there's a lot of, I think people are trying to do that insurrectionist work, and now really flip the demands for philosophy. I think in a way I'm trying to answer that call and say, let's do that. Let's
Yeah, yeah,
answer
yeah.
that call of how to create theories of resistance, how to create politically forward work that's going to try to help us transform the worlds that we're in, and respond to our own existential stakes. Like that's the call here, and I think I find that a very exciting one, because I think it lets us build collectively from the margins, so to say, and then also, like you say, put pressure on the center in order to either shift or transform, or to get out of the way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I go back and forth on mood personally on that one. I'm like, shift, enhance, expand,
yeah,
starve,
yeah.
delete.
Yes, 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 yes.
They're all legitimate strategies.
Yeah.
Well, let me pick up on some of the, this general term, from work done in the margins, and ask you um, about about this book and its implications for other work, and sort of in different marginal contexts. Because of course, your book, Anzaldúa's work, is very much about however unstable or under or unnameable it is, right? An ethno-racial identity, a particular kind of historical experience and memory. Um, and what you do is really give a detailed treatment of that conceptual and existential space. But as in the book, but also the themes of the sort of concepts of the book touch so much on other parts, other subaltern traditions, right? Other
Mhm.
traditions on the margins. And I was thinking in particular about the epigraph from Maria Lugones that begins your book, that evokes identity as chopped up, which is this really visceral image. It really caught me. I actually had to put the book down before I even started it, because I had to sit with that epigraph. Um, because for me, it links in such interesting ways to, and you mentioned fragmentation previously, the sort of post-Fanon Caribbean, this is my own research, post-Fanon Caribbean notions of fragmentation and creolization and the like. And so it made me
Mhm.
want to ask you, and this is really speculative, but you already mentioned Fanon, how you think that the Anzaldua's work, but your work on Anzaldúa as well, in the book, how you think it travels to these other geographies that have very different historical experiences, that have very different intellectual traditions and problems internal to them. But that's a part of traveling a theory, right? Is
Yeah.
a productive sense of exchange. So just how do you think this work travels?
That's a good question. Again, another to be determined kind of
Oh yeah,
to
yeah,
be obviously I don't know, I can't fully predict or think entirely through that. I mean, I know, on the one hand, like, I know with Anzaldua's work, I mean, I'll maybe set aside the question of the book for a minute. That there's been really interesting work on how her writings have traveled. So like there's pieces by Ana Rebecca Prada, that look at, the reading and relevance of Anzaldúa in the context of Bolivia, for example. This is not the Caribbean, of course, but like thinking about across the hemisphere. And so there's like, looking at the relevance and connections for feminist groups like Mujeres Creando in Bolivia and based in La Paz, and like trying to figure out what are the resonances between, you know, Anzaldúa as a queer Chicana writing in, the United States, and then having that even linguistically be translated and brought into a context like Bolivia. And so there's those kinds of dialogues going on, and there's also like among Anzaldúa's readers, there's in the Caribbean at least, there's also folks like Yuderquis Espinosa and Ochi Curiel, Afro-Dominican writers who are also writing about um, sexuality, queerness, race, neoliberalism. So there's also those threads of folks who see themselves as building from people like Lugones and others, and also citing people like Anzaldúa as having resonances with their own thinking now as a Afro-diasporic Latin American feminist trajectory. So there's also those lineages which are picked up in the Caribbean. I have to admit I'm not as well trained in francophone or anglophone Caribbean discourses, so I'm less confident in terms of or familiar with some or all of the ways that her work has been taken up. Anzaldúa's work or Lugones's work has been taken up in those directions. Although, like I have been in conversation with folks like Mike Monahan, who works also in Caribbean philosophy, and I know that he's reading Anzaldúa's work as connecting to creolization discourses, for example.
Mm.
So I have to be honest about my own sense there. I'm not tired.
Sure.
I don't know enough to really say to it. And I would love to read more about other folks who are working on Anzaldúa or creolization discourses that would be able to kind of shed some light for me about the relevance there. But I guess with respect to the book, part of the opening in that fifth chapter also about indigenous sovereignty and indigenous politics, I take also to be a trans border or, trans or, kind of geopolitically diverse kind of analysis, because one of the concerns that I think that Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo raises when she critiques Anzaldúa. So this was one of the major critics of Anzaldúa when she wrote this essay, "Who is the Indian in Aztlan?" That was her essay title. Really one of the things that she's trying to analyze both in that critique of Anzaldúa and in her later work, she has a book called Indian Given, which is a very fantastic book, is looking at also the different discourses of racialization, what she calls the racial geographies of Mexico and the U.S. And that, U.S. settler colonialism operates via a very different logic of contract law and exclusion of indigeneity. So indigeneity in terms of reservations, in terms of genocide and displacement, which is a very different form of settler colonial nationalism than mestizo nationalism, right? Mestizo nationalism is prefaced on inclusion, at least inclusion to the extent that the future is mixed, right? The future is mestizo. Yeah. But both, which I think is brilliant in her analysis, both those forms of nationalisms and settler colonial practice exclude indigenous claims to land and include indigenous claims to future resource and allocation rights. And so in terms of land and natural resources. And so I think like there's also these really interesting ways that we can read on, like if you kind of now, since I'm reapproaching Anzaldúa's work through that critique, like with that critique in mind, I think trying to address some of those concerns about indigenous land sovereignty through something like Nosotras, or through the kind of work that Two Spirit and other queer and trans indigenous scholars are doing, are really important because they see gender sovereignty as also a facet and a critique of settler colonialism. So I do think there's resonances there, but again, like that's another trans geopolitically diverse kind of expansion of this that is like, just another potential direction. But again, I think that will be kind of seen in the uptake in the future.
I mean, I just to say, what behind, I mean, I mentioned creolization. I mean, that's my own fragmentation, creolization, my own research interest, but I also think that the constellation of concepts in the book, in your book, and in Anzaldúa's work, it resonates in the sense of it's not the same, but it addresses and it lands in the same like critical space as really like the post-colonial world. I mean, the arbitrariness yet militarized borders of Africa, post-independence, which are borders of European divide, of
Yep.
Kashmir and the partition of India and Pakistan. I mean, there's so many ways of thinking about borders that are specific to places, right?
Yes.
But I think that the concepts that come out of this really add in new dimensions. That every theory that travels is transformed by where it lands. But I think these, it's a sort of first class ticket to a lot of these places, so to speak, in the sense of like, this book touches on so many things in post-colonial theory, but I think breathes actual fresh air into them. So.
Thank you. I mean, one just as an aside for a future project, just in terms of traveling, I'd like to kind of take some of this work and some of the critical tools from this book and from Anzaldúa's work and some of her readers to also think through my own context growing up in Florida. And so, like, with its own connections to the Caribbean, to military history, to tourism, to sex industries. I mean, there's so much to really explore with respect to South Florida and kind of Florida as a colonial project that I think would also be really interesting to explore. And so I do see even personally those kinds of potentials just for traveling across these other border spaces, right? Like Florida is a border space, and so trying to figure that out and try to read in that direction, I think would be really exciting as well.
Yeah, South Florida is its own philosophical issue, like issue problem, not in the colloquial sense, but as like a thing to be thought. It really
Yes,
just
yes,
is. I lived in
yes, it
South
is.
Florida for a year, and I was like, this is really not like the United States, but it
No,
is quintessentially the United States at the same
yes,
time, right? For all the reasons
yes.
you just said.
Well, and the colonial history of it itself is very interesting, right? It's not only the site of like, major contestations over ports and access, and also like seen as largely worthless for a long time given the swamplands to the south, but also sites of major indigenous resistance. I mean, like, the kind of the formation of Afro-Indigenous solidarities in Florida is also really important in terms of its own decolonial or anti-colonial projects. I do think, having a more nuanced lens about resistance, movements and networks within that space is important. Or, Stephanie Rivera Berrus is writing on Luisa Capatillo and the labor politics among Cubans and Puerto Ricans in the Tampa Bay region, and like there's really
Yeah.
interesting and important history there about kind of dialogue with the Caribbean, and with other kind of, like I said, anti-imperial projects or anti-colonial projects. It's certainly in the 19th century and also well into the 20th century.
Yeah, interesting. Let me ask you so two final questions. One about readers. When we write a book, um, my saying, which I think a lot of people have their version of it, is my greatest nightmare is that someone won't read my book, but my other nightmare is that someone will, right? Because there's something terrifying about your book going out there,
Yeah.
right? People read it,
Yes.
and you don't know what they're going to take from it, because that's the hermeneutic event, is that they come to
Yes.
it with their own prerogatives and so forth. And if we resist the imperial, like, everybody must think this after my book. Nevertheless, we as authors, as much as we understand the hermeneutic event of other readers, we do want something, I think, something to leave an impression, to alter the sensibilities of readers, to open new questions for them. My way of putting it is to have them walk differently after the book, right? To really get inside the body, to get inside affect and sensibility and thought. So, as you imagine readers, right? What do you want? How would you say what you want readers to walk away? Not a takeaway like a hot take, but like walk away
Mm-hmm.
differently in light of your book.
Um, well, it's funny that you mentioned this kind of fear of different interpretations, because I had a nice a really fantastic and generative conversation with folks from the Society for Mexican American Philosophy, and one of my readers was Francisco Gallegos, and he made this point about like, well, if we look at how right-wing tactics are taking up like leftist cultural politics, it gets really scary. And so like one of the interpretive possibilities becomes like far right appropriation of concepts. I mean, like this happens all over the place. And so like, I think of course there's like those nightmares, which I think, and I think, to be yeah, there's just a lot of those kinds of possibilities. But I think one of the things that I think in terms of trying to theorize from non-dominant positions and think about non-dominant patterns of resistance and groups and so on, like I think I'm trying to be hopefully the audiences that I had in mind are the ones who are going to get the most out of this book, which are going to be, authors who I think not only want to read Anzaldúa, but also want to read other authors of color, authors who are traversing linguistic boundaries, authors who are writing from the stakes of their personal existence rather than, mere intellectual exercise or something like that. So I think like I'm trying to reach an audience there, but I also, one of the, I guess maybe things that I hope that folks can walk away with is maybe set of tools for doing contextualist research. And I think I mentioned this early on that like I really think it matters that that I think someone like Fanon, for example, has now a really, I think, fantastic and rich breadth of scholars who are doing contextual work with his writings and with his political motivations and with his political solidarities in Algeria and elsewhere. I mean, like, so there's really, I think his work has really provided this like immense growth among scholars, not simply in philosophy, but much broadly outside of philosophy, to do contextual work. And I think what would be really exciting for Latinx feminism, Latinx philosophy, Latin American philosophy, perhaps also Caribbean philosophy, is also to have that kind of contextual nuance and care for how we approach a given author or a given set of topics, because I think like that's really going to give more life to the work that we're doing, right? It's going to create more openings, more possibilities, and that includes like I think some places are doing this already. So one of my colleagues and my partner, full disclosure, Elizabeth Paquette, runs the Feminist Decolonial Politics Workshop, and she's been running it for like at least, I don't know, I think it's like 6 years now. And part of her motivation for that is to read one woman of color author for a week, to read as much as we possibly can of that author in terms of breadth and scope of their writing, so that we don't cherry pick or tokenize a text or an idea that then gets divorced from the context in which that person was producing it, who they were in dialogue with, and what they cared about. And so I think like that, I really hope people take that care and that breadth of possibility with them from the book, because I think that we need just more of that kind of attention to particularly scholars of color or scholars writing from historically marginalized positions. Like we can do that. Like we have the tools to do that, and I think that we can see the growth of philosophical work through doing that. So I think that's one of my hopes.
And I really love the nuance and care as a philosophical practice, as a readerly practice. That's really nicely put. I like that. Well, what about you? I mean, the just as we were saying, writing isn't like this sort of painting of the solo writer in a corner at a desk. Also, writing is not, I had a snapshot in my head of everything I wanted to say, and then I just went and said what I already knew I wanted to say. Like writing the book is, I mean, we transform as we write, I often talk about, when I was, I think, a sophomore in college, I told my professor I was having a hard time writing, but all my ideas were great. And he's like, you don't even know your ideas until you write this essay. And I didn't like that because I was trying to get an extension. But, there was depth to that, in the sense of like, in the process of writing, we do change. So how do you wrote the book, it's now some distance from it. How do you, in sort of retrospect, walk away from the project? And I mean that just in terms of, maybe a word about how your own sensibilities were changed through the book, but also this invitation to talk about new projects. And I say invitation to talk about new projects because you have a right to just enjoy your book and not like, what's the next thing? I both hate and live that workaholic, I'm on the next project thing. But how do you walk away differently, and sort of where is it leading you?
Um, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think was really a wonderful experience while I was writing the book was visiting Anzaldua's archive at the Benson collection in the University of Texas, Austin. Which that was like as a process that was I'm not traditionally trained to be working in archives. Like that was not something that I took a methods class on in philosophy. I mean, of course historians do get formal training in that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or many do. And so in a sense that was a new process for me, which I also leaned on some of my historian friends and other folks to try to help me through. But that was, I think that kind of goes back to this like um, adding dimensionality to the the projects, or to the type of care that we can do as readers. Because seeing, like, at least in Anzaldua's archive, like, finding little notes that she had written to friends, or that friends had written to her, or finding receipts for things that she was like struggling to pay off, or like things that were like the
Uh-huh.
the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
detritus of everyday life, are important, because it reminds us of, again, like the embodied um, beings and processes that we're going through, and that she went through in order to write and to eventually get something like a polished piece that becomes available for then many of us to read many years later. So I think like the archival process was transformative in that way, not only for the kind of material resonances, but also like understanding her relationships to other people in her life,
Yeah.
which don't always show up in the written work. And so, like, I think one of the things that I also walk away with in terms of the book is like I still have a lot of unanswered questions about Anzaldua's own writings, but also kind of her life and her practice as a I don't know if you want to say a feminist scholar, or as an activist, or however you want to frame her. Because one of the things I spent a lot of time when I visited the archive reading her letters with the Mohawk scholar Beth Brandt, the Mohawk poet and author Beth Brandt. And I'm actually working on that now. So just kind of thinking of future directions. So what I'm writing on is like, okay, one of the questions that emerged at the end of the book for me was, again, like, how has Anzaldua's work responded to the calls for indigenous sovereignty and indigenous political futures? And so one of the ways to answer that is not just to look at her published materials, but to then look at what were her political relationships like with indigenous people in her life. Like what was she living as a praxis among indigenous people that was part of her, you know, um, her life world, and part of the way that she's found herself being committed and in relations to solidarity. And so, in fact, right now, like just at the end of this month, and likely for another talk this semester, I'm going to be again working through those letters with Beth Brandt, because one of the things that emerges there is not only like that they have an intimate friendship, but they're also exploring queerness from different positionalities with respect to, like, Brandt as writing as I said, as a Mohawk woman, as somebody who was living in Detroit and living but had frequently had like family relationships and kinship connections to the Bay of Quinte First Nation, and also like trying to negotiate her queerness in relation to other Native women, turns to Anzaldúa as a Chicana and starts like kind of dialoguing with her about the differences and the similarities of identifying as queer within a community that she desperately wants to find herself in, but also feeling that internal dissonance as a lesbian or as a queer person now within their own respective communities. And so I found that to be a really productive and interesting dialogue. There's also like material questions about who's getting paid for what work that they're writing. And I think that's really important, again, back to the material conditions of our work, like, compensation and, being materially supported for the work that you produce is tremendously important. And at the time that both Beth Brandt and Anzaldúa are putting together anthologies, the first of their kind on, for example, in Beth Brandt's case, Native American women writers, these are tremendously important in terms of how these authors are not just being read, but also being supported materially by publishers or by their readers or by awards and scholarships and so on to be able to continue to do that work. So I think there's those dimensions of their friendship about negotiating the kind of like financial side or the material resource side of being a writer from a non-dominant group, a non-dominant positionality, and then also fighting against trends to exploit their labor or exploit their ideas, or to get a speaking invitation with no money offered, or lots of these things that are part of that reality. So I think to me that's very interesting, and that's something I'm still working on. So I mean, those are some unanswered questions. I also, another project that I'm kind of thinking through is, and this also came up through the Beth Brandt correspondence with Anzaldúa, but also through the book more generally, is also I'm working on a project on Latinx critiques of carceral institutions. And I think some of the work on Nosotras and agency are going to be really helpful for thinking through an abolitionist politic, which is another kind of scope of my work, is thinking through prison abolitionism as a kind of multiplicitous agential project. So yeah, that's some of the things on the horizon.
Well, I can't wait to see where all of this goes. These are not only like extremely interesting projects you're talking about, but I really do think urgent at multiple levels, and in that way reflects my sort of broadest take on your book, which is that it's interesting and urgent at the same time. And may we all write interesting and urgent books. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this book. It's so interesting. Absolutely, I didn't say this at the beginning, I learned so much from the book, and that's my favorite kind of book, where I get to walk away having learned, but also a lot of energy for comparative study and exchange. And so having this chance to hear you talk about it and talk with you a little bit about the ideas has been a real treat. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate this time as well. Appreciate it.
All right, Andrea, take care.
You too.